It starts the same way every morning for 47 million American households. The alarm goes off. You make coffee. You check your phone. You are, by every visible measure, a free person in a free country. You choose where you shop, what you eat, where you work, where you live. Or at least, that is what the system wants you to believe. Take Daniel Reyes. He's 41, works in logistics management outside Phoenix. Makes $78,000 a year. By most reckonings, he's doing fine. And yet, Daniel hasn't been able to buy a home for 6 years. Every time he approaches the down payment threshold, the market shifts. Properties he could have purchased in 2020 for $290,000 now list at $480,000. He keeps renting. He keeps paying. And every single month, a portion of his rent, without him ever knowing it, travels up a chain of financial instruments and lands inside a portfolio managed by the largest asset management firm in the history of human civilization. That firm is BlackRock, and Daniel has never heard of it. Here is the uncomfortable truth about modern American life. Between your paycheck and your actual daily existence sits an invisible architecture, a system of capital allocation so vast, so deeply wired into the national economy, that no single government agency, no congressional committee, no investigative journalist has ever mapped it in full. It functions in the negative space between things you can see. It operates through proxy votes, software algorithms, revolving door relationships, and the quiet accumulation of stakes in every sector that touches your life. Housing, healthcare, energy, technology, defense, retail, food, the institutions that manage your retirement, the index funds your HR department nudges you toward, the firms that insure your car, the companies that own the apartment complexes your kids might one day live in. All of it, in some traceable way, connects back to one address in Midtown Manhattan, 50 Hudson Yards, New York City, the global headquarters of BlackRock Incorporated. By early 2026, BlackRock manages approximately $11.6 trillion in assets. For context, the entire annual economic output of the United States, every factory, every software company, every hospital, every farm, every restaurant, totals roughly $28 trillion. BlackRock is responsible for allocating nearly 40% of that number. Not in cash, not in a vault, but through stakes, and more stakes. Positions in companies, bonds, real estate trusts, government securities, index funds threading through every major market on Earth. No emperor in history commanded this much economic territory. And at the center of this empire is one man, Lawrence Douglas Fink, born 1952, Van Nuys, California, son of a shoe store owner and an English professor. He didn't inherit wealth. He built infrastructure. In 1988, he and 7 partners launched BlackRock out of a single room in a borrowed office. The original thesis was not domination. It was risk. Specifically, the idea that nobody on Wall Street truly understood the risk embedded in the mortgage-backed securities market. Fink believed data, properly organized, could see what human intuition could not. He was right, and that rightness, compounded over 38 years, has produced something the world has never seen before. Not a bank, not a hedge fund, not a government. Something in between all three and answerable to none of them. That is precisely the point. The most powerful financial entity in American history was not built by robber barons. It was built by a man who understood, better than anyone alive, how to make himself indispensable to everyone at once. Governments, corporations, pension funds, competitors. He didn't conquer the system. He became the system. And the system, your retirement account, your mortgage rate, your grocery prices, your employer's stock options, runs on a piece of software that most people have never heard of. A program that processes more financial data every single day than any government regulator on Earth has the capacity to analyze. They call it Aladdin. and it is the closest thing to a financial god the modern world has ever built. Every morning, before the New York Stock Exchange opens, before a single trader has taken their seat, before Larry Fink has finished his first cup of coffee, a machine has already done the work. It has already evaluated the risk profiles of millions of financial instruments. It has already stress-tested thousands of portfolios against hundreds of economic scenarios. It has already run simulations of what happens if interest rates spike 2 points, or if oil drops 40%, or if a government in Southeast Asia defaults on its bonds. The machine's name is Aladdin, an acronym: Asset, Liability, Debt, and Derivative Investment Network. But that's the kind of bureaucratic label that obscures what Aladdin actually is. In plain terms, Aladdin is the central nervous system of global finance. It is the single most important piece of financial software ever built, and almost nobody outside of institutional finance knows it exists. Here is the number that should stop you cold. As of 2026, Aladdin monitors and manages the risk of portfolios totaling more than $21 trillion in assets. Those portfolios don't all belong to BlackRock. In fact, the majority of Aladdin's clients are BlackRock's direct competitors: Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, major sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, pension administrators. They all pay BlackRock, a private company, to use its proprietary software to manage their own money. Think about that architecture for a moment. It means that BlackRock doesn't just manage the largest pool of assets in history under its own name. It also operates the analytical brain of its competitors. It sees their portfolios. It understands their risk exposures. It knows, before any regulator, before any competing trader, before any government, what stress looks like in a system that controls the financial destiny of hundreds of millions of people. This is not a conspiracy. This is the product of brilliant engineering applied to a fundamental market problem. After the 2008 financial crisis, the world learned, catastrophically, that nobody truly understood interconnected systemic risk. Banks had sold each other mortgage-backed securities in a daisy chain of leveraged exposure that nobody had fully mapped. When one piece failed, the whole structure collapsed like a building where no single engineer had ever looked at the blueprints from start to finish. BlackRock had built Aladdin precisely to see those blueprints. And after 2008, when the US government needed to understand what it had just inherited in the bailout of AIG, of Bear Stearns, of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, it called BlackRock. Because BlackRock was the only firm in the world with the software to map what the government had just agreed to stand behind. That contract was the key that opened every door. From 2008 onward, BlackRock's relationship with the US government was no longer that of vendor and client. It was something closer to a permanent institutional advisor. The firm had, in effect, become the Federal Reserve's risk consultant. And in that role, Aladdin's data advantage compounded with each passing year. By 2026, the program runs simulations across 5,000 different economic scenarios every single week. It processes over 250 million data inputs daily. The computing infrastructure behind it is comparable in scale to the largest cloud systems operated by Amazon and Google, except that instead of streaming movies or storing photos, it is continuously modeling the structural integrity of the global financial system. Here is the part that never gets reported in mainstream financial media. Aladdin doesn't just observe, it shapes. When Aladdin identifies a risk cluster, when its algorithms flag that too much capital is concentrated in a specific sector, or that a particular class of debt instruments is carrying more embedded risk than the market has priced, it generates recommendations. Those recommendations go simultaneously to BlackRock's own investment teams and, through the client interface, to the competing firms who subscribe to the service. In a world of ostensibly competing asset managers, they're all reading from the same oracle. They are all receiving risk signals generated by the same proprietary engine, owned by the same company. The net effect is not technically collusion, but the behavioral result, a convergence of risk assessments across nominally competing firms, is economically equivalent to something the antitrust laws were written to prevent. The implications of this go beyond finance. When the largest institutional investors in the world are all operating from the same risk model, they tend to move in the same direction at the same time. In a market downturn, this is catastrophic, not because any single firm is reckless, but because the herd has been mathematically engineered to move together. The diversification that markets depend on for resilience is silently being eroded by the uniformity that Aladdin produces. Former SEC officials have raised this exact concern in testimony. Academic economists at MIT and the University of Chicago have published peer-reviewed papers on what they call common ownership risk, the phenomenon whereby the same few entities holding significant stakes across competing companies reduces the competitive incentive for those companies to fight each other on price or innovation. When BlackRock owns 5% of Coca-Cola and 5% of PepsiCo simultaneously, and both companies know it, neither company has the same incentive to undercut the other. And Aladdin is the instrument that makes that common ownership legible, manageable, and scalable at a level no human organization could otherwise sustain. But Aladdin is only half the story. Because while BlackRock was building the world's most sophisticated risk management tool, it was simultaneously making a quieter, more personal kind of investment. It was buying the streets you live on. By the spring of 2026, the American homeownership rate has slipped to its lowest point since the Carter administration. Approximately 61.4% of American households own their homes, a number that sounds respectable until you account for the age distribution. Among Americans under 40, the rate has fallen below 42%. The generation that was supposed to build equity, raise families, and retire on the wealth of appreciating real estate is, instead, permanently renting. The reasons are not mysterious, but they are rarely explained with precision. It is not simply that housing prices are high. It is that a structurally new class of buyer entered the American real estate market beginning around 2012, accelerated massively through the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, and has never left. That buyer does not need a mortgage. That buyer does not care about school districts. That buyer purchases in bulk with institutional capital and converts single-family homes into long-term rental inventory at scale across every major metropolitan market in the country. The entity that catalyzed this transformation most aggressively is not BlackRock directly, though the confusion is understandable. The key vehicles are the real estate investment trusts, REITs, and single-family rental platforms that BlackRock either holds significant stakes in or manages capital for. Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, Progress Residential, Tricon Residential. These are the operating companies whose names appear on lease agreements, whose maintenance lines go unanswered, whose rent increases arrive like clockwork every 12 months regardless of local economic conditions. Invitation Homes alone owns or manages more than 80,000 homes across 16 major U.S. markets. It was spun out of Blackstone, the private equity firm that shares a founding lineage with BlackRock before the two separated in 1994 and it IPO'd in 2017, with BlackRock as one of its largest institutional shareholders at various points since. The architecture of who owns what, through which fund, at which reporting threshold, requires a forensic accountant and a team of lawyers to trace. That opacity is not accidental. Here is the mechanism that makes this arrangement particularly elegant and particularly troubling. The capital that finances the purchase of these homes does not come from billionaires writing personal checks. It comes, in substantial part, from public pension funds, university endowments, and 401k accounts. In other words, it comes from American workers. The pension fund for California public school teachers has money in BlackRock-managed vehicles that have exposure to real estate investment trusts. The 403(b) account of a hospital administrator in Cleveland routes a portion of her retirement savings through a target date fund managed by BlackRock, which allocates a slice to real estate. The 401(k) that Daniel Reyes contributes to every pay period, his best available tool for building long-term wealth, holds index funds that BlackRock's iShares platform operates, some of which carry positions in the companies that own the homes he cannot afford to buy. Daniel is, through the mechanism of American retirement savings, partially financing his own exclusion from homeownership. His retirement savings help fund the entities that have turned home buying into a competitive sport that institutional capital wins every time. This is not a criminal enterprise. Every entity involved operates within the law. The 401(k) system, the REIT structure, the institutional capital markets, these are all legitimate. What has happened is that the legal architecture of American finance, built piecemeal over 70 years, has produced an emergent outcome that no legislature explicitly designed: a permanent renter class, funding its own perpetual tenancy through the very retirement accounts that were supposed to liberate it. The numbers make the point without drama. In 2012, institutional investors owned roughly 2% of single-family rental homes in the United States. By 2026, that number is approaching 14% in targeted Sun Belt markets, and in some zip codes around Atlanta, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, institutional ownership of available rental properties exceeds 30%. In a tight market, a landlord with 30% market share does not need to price competitively. It prices to hold. And here is the final irony that the system has engineered: the very mechanism designed to help working Americans build wealth. The 401(k), the IRA, the target date fund, has become the capital pipeline that feeds the machine, pricing them out of ownership. Not through malice, not through conspiracy, through the compounding logic of a financial architecture that was designed for efficiency, not equity. When researchers at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies published their 2025 analysis of institutional home buying patterns, they found something that sent ripples through policy circles. Markets with higher concentrations of institutional single-family ownership showed lower rates of first-time homebuyer entry, higher average rent increases over 5-year periods, and lower neighborhood investment in maintenance and improvement. The correlation was not perfect, but it was consistent enough to describe a pattern. A pattern that, if you follow the capital upstream through the funds and vehicles and management contracts, eventually leads you back to the same address in Midtown Manhattan. And in Washington, D.C., where the relationship between BlackRock and the federal government has grown so intimate that the distinction between private actor and government agent has, at various critical moments, effectively disappeared. In the American constitutional framework, there are 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, each with defined powers, each with formal accountability to the public, each with, at least in theory, a transparent process by which decisions are made and power is exercised. Then there is BlackRock. This is not hyperbole. It is a structural observation that a bipartisan collection of economists, former regulators, and institutional critics have made repeatedly, and that the mainstream financial press has largely declined to examine with the rigor it deserves. BlackRock does not have an elected mandate. It does not hold a regulatory charter. It is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. It does not conduct open public meetings. And yet, at 2 of the most consequential financial moments in 21st century American history, the United States government effectively handed BlackRock the controls. September 2008, the U.S. government has just absorbed the obligations of Bear Stearns, AIG, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. Together, the toxic asset portfolios being assumed represent trillions in mortgage-backed securities that nobody, not the Treasury, not the Federal Reserve, not any bank in America, can accurately value. The government needs someone who can. It calls BlackRock. Specifically, it contracts BlackRock Solutions, the consulting arm built on Aladdin, to analyze the acquired portfolios, manage the assets, and advise on disposition. It is a remarkable arrangement. A private firm, with its own investment portfolio and its own competitive interests, is retained to manage the government's emergency asset holdings with minimal public oversight, minimal competitive bidding, and no structural firewall between BlackRock's proprietary trading interests and the information it now holds about the government's position. The contract is later reviewed by the Federal Reserve's Inspector General. The review is measured. It notes the lack of competitive process. It notes the absence of formal conflict of interest protocols. It recommends improvements. The recommendations are noted. And then, 12 years later, the same arrangement happens again, only larger. March 2020. The Federal Reserve, responding to the COVID-induced market collapse, announces 3 historic emergency programs: the Primary Market Corporate Credit Facility, the Secondary Market Corporate Credit Facility, and the Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility. Together, these programs are authorized to purchase up to $750 billion in corporate bonds. In effect, a direct government intervention in the corporate credit market at a scale never before attempted. The Fed retains an outside manager to operationalize these programs. Without competitive bidding, without public announcement of the selection process, the manager, BlackRock Financial Markets Advisory. The conflict of interest embedded in this arrangement is not subtle. BlackRock manages iShares exchange-traded funds that hold corporate bonds. The government programs it is being paid to run are purchasing corporate bonds, in some cases including ETFs managed by BlackRock's own iShares division. BlackRock is simultaneously the government's agent and a beneficiary of the government's action. The Fed acknowledges the conflict. It implements a waiver. It says the benefits of using BlackRock, its unmatched data infrastructure, its market relationships, its operational capacity to move fast in a crisis, outweigh the conflict risks. This may be true, but it is also a description of a monopoly. The government is telling the public that it has no choice but to hire a private firm with conflicting interests because that firm has made itself so indispensable to the financial system that there is literally no alternative. That is not market. That is a captured state. The revolving door between BlackRock and the highest levels of the U.S. government has been documented. Brian Dees, who served as BlackRock's global head of sustainable investing, became the director of the National Economic Council under President Biden, one of the most powerful economic policy positions in the executive branch. Adewale Adeyemo, BlackRock's first chief of staff, became Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. Ben Bernanke, the former Federal Reserve chairman who hired BlackRock during the 2008 crisis, joined BlackRock as a senior advisor after leaving government. None of this is illegal. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington has existed for decades. But BlackRock's version of it has a particular character. The people moving through it are not simply former regulators who go to collect their payday in the private sector. They are people who built the intellectual architecture of modern financial risk management in the private sector, then moved into government to apply that framework, a framework designed by and advantageous to the firm they came from, and then returned. The result, over time, is a federal financial bureaucracy that thinks in BlackRock's analytical language, trusts BlackRock's data, and is culturally predisposed to BlackRock solutions. This is not corruption in the legal sense, but it is the elimination of independent institutional judgment at the highest levels of the American financial state. And it makes the question of who actually sets U.S. financial policy an increasingly open one. When the next financial crisis comes, and the architects of this system know it will, the question will not be whether BlackRock gets called. It will be whether anyone in Washington will remember how to do it without them. And that is the kind of dependency that, in a functioning democracy, should require a public conversation that has never fully happened. Instead, the conversation the country has been having, loudly, divisively, with real consequences, has been about something else that BlackRock has quietly colonized: the governance of every major corporation in America. You probably don't think of yourself as a shareholder in Apple, but if you have a 401k, an IRA, or any employer-sponsored retirement account invested in a broad index fund, you are. And so is your teacher, your firefighter, your sanitation worker. Collectively, millions of ordinary Americans own fractional stakes in Apple, Amazon, Exxon, JP Morgan, Boeing, and every other major publicly traded company in the country, channeled through funds managed by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. This is the great democratic promise of the index fund era. Ordinary people get exposure to corporate America's growth, but there's a hidden cost, and it is paid in the form of governance. When you invest in an index fund, you own the shares, but you don't vote them. BlackRock does. And BlackRock votes on corporate matters at thousands of annual general meetings across the world, using your shares as the instrument of its own policy preferences. The numbers here require a moment of stillness. BlackRock's managed funds hold, in aggregate, between 5 and 9% of the shares of virtually every company in the S&P 500, in some cases more. This makes BlackRock the single largest shareholder, often larger than any individual institution, any family, any founder, at company after company. And at every annual meeting, those shares vote as a block, directed by a proxy voting policy developed internally at BlackRock, with no public input and no democratic mandate. For most of the 2010s, BlackRock used this power quietly. It voted with management on most proposals. It engaged companies privately. It described its governance philosophy as constructive stewardship, a phrase that means, roughly, we will push for change through private channels rather than confrontational votes. The strategy was designed to keep corporate relationships smooth, and it worked for a while. Then came the letters. Beginning in 2018, Larry Fink began publishing annual open letters to the chief executives of every major corporation in which BlackRock held significant stakes, which is to say, virtually every major corporation in America and much of the world. The letters were philosophical missives on the purpose of corporations. They talked about stakeholder capitalism, about climate change, about diversity, about the obligation of business to serve society, not merely shareholders. In 2020, the letter declared that BlackRock would make sustainability, and specifically climate risk, a central criterion of its investment decisions. In practice, this meant voting against board members at companies that didn't meet BlackRock's internal climate disclosure standards. It meant supporting shareholder resolutions, pushing companies toward net zero emissions commitments. It meant redirecting capital at the margin away from fossil fuel companies and toward renewable energy infrastructure. On its own terms, some of this made rational financial sense. Climate risk is real. The stranded asset problem in fossil fuels, the possibility that reserves and infrastructure will become worthless as energy transition accelerates, is a legitimate investment consideration. But there was a category confusion in how BlackRock packaged this shift, and its critics from both the left and the right identified it with precision. BlackRock was using the capital of ordinary Americans, capital placed with it for the purpose of generating retirement income, to advance a specific policy agenda on climate and corporate governance that those Americans had never voted for, never debated, and in many cases strongly opposed. The Texas school teacher whose pension fund had a BlackRock mandate was effectively casting ESG-aligned proxy votes at ExxonMobil, whether she wanted to or not. The political backlash, when it came, was fierce and, in purely structural terms, entirely predictable. By 2022, The attorneys general of 19 Republican-led states had sent letters to BlackRock accusing it of violating its fiduciary duty to state pension beneficiaries by prioritizing ESG goals over financial returns. Texas passed legislation prohibiting state entities from doing business with firms that boycott fossil fuel companies, a law explicitly aimed at BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, and others pulled state pension fund mandates from BlackRock. The political framing was pointed. A New York-based financial giant was dictating energy policy to American states through the proxy voting power of their own retirement savings. The accusation was that this was undemocratic, and on the mechanics, it was difficult to argue otherwise. BlackRock's response was revealing. In late 2022 and through 2023, it began walking back the most aggressive elements of its ESG posture. It announced changes to its proxy voting approach that gave some large institutional clients more direct control over how their shares were voted. A partial concession that the company's critics described as a retreat and its defenders described as a maturation. By 2025, Fink himself stopped using the term ESG in public communications, reportedly because the acronym had become too politically toxic in the American market. But the underlying architecture of common ownership hasn't changed. BlackRock still votes the shares. It still sets the governance agenda in its private engagements with corporate boards. It still has the leverage that comes from being the largest institutional shareholder in the room. The ESG war was, in some sense, a battle over the label. The power it was fought over is still entirely intact. And that power, the ability to direct the strategic decisions of the companies that employ millions of Americans, supply their goods, and determine their economic conditions, is concentrated in ways that the architects of American corporate law never anticipated. It is the culmination of a decades-long structural shift, and it has produced a system so tightly wound, so circular in its dependencies, that the critical question of 2026 is no longer how BlackRock got here. It is what happens if it cracks. In financial risk management, there's a concept called correlation. Under normal conditions, markets are imperfectly correlated. When some assets fall in value, others rise, and the net effect is a kind of economic ballast that prevents any single disruption from toppling the whole system. Diversification, in this framework, is not merely a strategy. It is the mechanism by which the financial system maintains its structural resilience. Now consider what happens when a single entity, through its own portfolio, through Aladdin's risk signals, through its proxy voting, through its management of competitor funds, has gradually, legally, and without explicit design, reduced the meaningful diversification of institutional capital across the global economy. Not to zero, not to a dangerous monoculture overnight, but incrementally, consistently, in the direction of greater correlation, greater herding, greater uniformity of reaction when the signal says, sell. The academic literature on this problem has grown substantially since 2019. Researchers at Princeton, the London School of Economics, and the Bank for International Settlements have independently modeled the systemic risk implications of concentrated asset management. Their findings, stated carefully in the language of academic economics, amount to a consistent warning. The current structure amplifies tail risk. It means that low-probability, high-severity financial events, the kind that the system's architects describe as once-in-a-generation disruptions, may now be more likely and more severe when they occur, precisely because of the efficiency that concentrated management produces. The paradox is almost elegant. Aladdin was built to see and manage risk better than any system before it, and it does exactly that for the individual portfolios it monitors. But the cumulative effect of every large institutional investor using the same risk framework is that when Aladdin says the system is at risk, everyone moves at once. And when everyone moves at once in the same direction, the thing they're all trying to avoid becomes inevitable. There's a further fragility embedded in the structure that nobody in official Washington has been willing to say plainly. BlackRock is, operationally speaking, too big to fail. Not in the legal sense established after 2008. It is not a bank. It does not hold deposits. It is not technically a systemically important financial institution under existing regulatory designations. But in the practical sense, if BlackRock were to experience a crisis of confidence, a major operational failure, a catastrophic legal judgment, a cascading client redemption event, the consequences would propagate through the financial system in ways that no regulator has a clear plan to manage. The FDIC does not insure BlackRock's clients. The Fed cannot directly recapitalize a failing asset manager. The Treasury has no established protocol for the failure of a private investment firm managing assets equivalent to 40% of U.S. GDP. The playbook, if the worst happened, would be improvised, and the only institution with the data and analytical infrastructure to help would be BlackRock itself. This is the circularity that defines BlackRock's position in the modern economy. It is the solution and the problem simultaneously. It built the tools that governments depend on, while becoming the entity that those tools cannot adequately measure. It holds the capital of the people who would be harmed if it failed. It manages the portfolios of the competitors it would crowd out in a crisis. It advises the regulators who are nominally responsible for overseeing it. And it does all of this within the letter of existing law, which was written for a world in which this kind of concentration was not considered possible. The question of whether this represents the end of the free market is not a radical one. It is a question being asked in different registers by economists from Milton Friedman's intellectual lineage and from John Maynard Keynes's. Because what we have built, not through any single decision, not through conspiracy, but through the compounding of individually rational choices over 4 decades, is not a free market. It is managed capitalism at a scale that makes the regulatory state look small. Free markets, in the classical sense, require competitive pressure, distributed ownership, and independent actors making decisions based on independent information. What the Aladdin era has produced is convergent risk signals processed by the same platform, distributed ownership concentrated in the hands of 3 firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, that together constitute the largest shareholder in most Fortune 500 companies, and a revolving door between those firms and the regulatory apparatus that is supposed to keep them honest. None of this is foreordained. The structural conditions that have produced BlackRock's dominance were created by decisions, legislative, regulatory, cultural, made over time by real human beings with real alternatives. The defined contribution retirement system, the index fund revolution, the post-2008 regulatory framework that favored scale, the SEC rules on disclosure that allow beneficial ownership to be obscured behind layers of fund structures. Each of these was a choice, and choices can be revisited. The congressional proposals currently moving through committee in 2026, the Mutual Fund Voting Transparency Act, the Common Ownership Conflict Disclosure Rule, the proposed amendment to the Investment Advisors Act requiring Aladdin-class platforms to register as market infrastructure, represent the beginning of a policy response. They are, in most analysts' assessment, insufficient to the scale of the problem, but they're the first signs that the invisible architecture is slowly becoming visible. What awareness demands is not paranoia. It is precision. It is the ability to follow a dollar from your paycheck to your index fund, to the REIT that owns your neighbor's house, to the shareholder vote that determined your employer's board composition. It is the ability to see with clear eyes that the most powerful financial entity in American history is not a government, is not a bank, is not a corporation in any conventional sense, and that it answers formally to none of them. The free market was the greatest idea the modern world produced. The irony of our age is that its most brilliant practitioners have quietly replaced it, legally, efficiently, and with the full participation of the people most harmed by its disappearance. You are not paying rent to a landlord. You are not contributing to a retirement plan. You're not buying groceries from a company. You are feeding a system. And the system, above a certain threshold of concentration, does not need your consent. It only needs your money.